They said the fog was always thicker near the Bellgrave property. A kind of permanent dusk hung over that hillside, as if the sun had long since given up trying to reach it. When I arrived in the town of Grey Marrow, my intention had been academic. A sabbatical grant, a dead-end thesis on legacy architecture in New England, and a final chance to make something publishable out of a stagnant career. What I didn't expect was to become entangled in a family history so rotted with secrecy. Its roots extended not only into the soil, but into the town's psyche. The Bellgrave estate stood at the end of a narrow, tree-choked road, overgrown and closed to vehicles. I had to walk the final quarter-mile on foot, accompanied only by the sound of my boots crunching frost-covered leaves and the distant, irregular caw of unseen crows. The house revealed itself slowly through the mist, an imposing Victorian monolith of soot-dark brick, 3 stories tall, with dormer windows sealed with planks and a veranda sagging like a tired mouth. No one had lived there in decades, according to the town record. And yet, every other month, a man from the bank deposited fresh supplies at the gate. The deed said the property belonged to the Bellgrave lineage in perpetuity. No sale, no foreclosure, just a signature renewed every generation. But what chilled me wasn't the legal oddity. It was the fact that, in over 170 years of Bellgrave family existence, not a single death certificate had ever been issued. My interviews with the townspeople were hesitant affairs. Most claimed ignorance. Others grew visibly nervous at the mention of the Bellgraves. One old postmaster, retired, rheumy-eyed, told me he used to deliver letters to the house when he was young. Always addressed in looping black ink, no stamps, no return address. And always, he said, he got the feeling someone was watching from the attic. In the town hall archive, a locked filing cabinet labeled Restricted Historical Interest only yielded several oddities. Handwritten ledgers from the early 1900s documented unofficial burial ceremonies conducted on the property grounds. But there were no tombstones, no graves, just brief entries. March 2, 1908, Edwin Bellgrave, interned per instruction. Witnessed by local doctor, no pronouncement issued. The language was always the same, interned, witnessed, no pronouncement, as if death was not a state, but a suggestion politely ignored. My first night on the property, I stayed in what remained of the old caretaker's quarters, a modest structure, damp and brittle with age, adjacent to the main house. Around 2 a.m., I awoke to the sound of movement on the veranda, slow, deliberate creaks along rotted wood. I froze, listened, then silence. But when I examined the porch in the morning light, the old layer of dust had been disturbed. Bare footprints, wide-set and human, led from the veranda steps to the sealed main door. Inside the estate, the air smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic and sour, like rusted tools or dried blood. The parlor was draped in heavy cloths, and every mirror in the house had been shattered, as if reflecting something unbearable. Most disturbing was the central hall, where 6 family portraits hung in a perfect line. Patriarchs, matriarchs, children, all unsmiling, all eyes painted a shade too real. Beneath each painting, an engraved nameplate, except none included birth or death dates, only initials. The most recent portrait, painted in a disturbingly modern style, depicted a girl with hollow cheeks and pale blue eyes. Her plate read simply, SB. I tried researching her. Nothing in school records, medical databases, or social services. It was as if she'd been born solely to be painted. My second night was colder. The caretaker's fireplace no longer functioned, and I lay under 3 layers of blankets listening. At 3:17 a.m., the sounds came again. Not from the veranda this time, but from inside the house. With settling, I told myself, old beams. But then came a tapping sound. 3 slow knocks. Not on a door, on the wall. The wall between my room and the main house, which I had confirmed was bricked over decades ago. The following day, I explored the house again. In the upstairs corridor, I found a locked door, thick, iron-banded. On its surface were scratches, deep gouges in the wood, clustered low, around ankle height, like fingernails. That was the first time I began to doubt the boundaries of the investigation. Not just academically, but personally. The Bellgraves were not remembered. They were erased. No obituaries, no memorials, just rumors and omissions, politely unspoken. The town had developed an amnesia, ritualized through silence. Even the Historical Society warned me gently that some houses prefer their privacy. That night, I dreamed I was being buried. Slowly, reverently. Not by hands, but by something cold and invisible. A weight pressing from all sides, a silence too thick to scream through. I awoke gasping, my fingernails filled with soil. Or something that looked like it. I haven't told anyone that part. Not even in my preliminary report. I worry how it will be interpreted. The final entry in the town's archived ledger, the most recent interaction with the Bellgrave property, was dated March 13, 1997. It simply read, SB entered dormancy. Awaiting renewal. Dormancy, not death. Awaiting renewal. I'm staying one more week. I know I should leave, but I need to understand. I've begun hearing breathing in the central parlor when the wind dies down. And sometimes, just as I'm falling asleep, I think I hear the hinges of that upstairs door moaning softly, not from the wind, but from the weight of something inside, trying gently to push it open. The first thing I confirmed with certainty was that no member of the Bellgrave family had ever been buried in Grey Marrow Cemetery. I spent a full day cross-referencing death indexes, tombstone registries, and obituary ledgers stored in the county's climate-controlled archives. The name Bellgrave never appeared, not once, in any official capacity. It was impossible. A family that influential, whose estate loomed like a cathedral of rot above the town, should have left behind at least a few graves. And yet, the ground outside the cemetery gates bore no trace of mourning. No stones, no records, just silence. The cemetery caretaker, Mr. Thorne, had worked there for 46 years. When I asked if he had ever overseen a Bellgrave funeral, his mouth went tight. They don't die like the rest of us, he muttered, eyes lowered. They don't go in the ground. I pressed gently. What did he mean? He looked up sharply. It's not your place to ask that. Not your place to dig it up either. Some families, they handle things on their own. I asked again if he had ever attended one of their services. He shook his head and walked away. What disturbed me more than the absence of funerals was the way people spoke around it, as if death itself had been redefined in the Bellgrave context. A local florist named Lydia recalled receiving orders for large quantities of lilies and violets every few years, but never for the cemetery and never attached to a public event. They'd get delivered to the estate, she said. No card, no announcement, just flowers and silence. When I asked if she ever saw who picked them up, she hesitated. No, but I always had the feeling someone was already waiting by the gate, like they knew exactly when I'd arrive. The town pastor, Reverend Cale, had served Grey Marrow for 3 decades. When I asked him if he'd ever conducted a Bellgrave funeral, he looked at me with something like pity. They never asked me to. Never asked any clergy. Said their beliefs were older. Older than what, I asked. Older than the church, he replied. Older than town records. They didn't believe in endings. Just transitions. I asked what that meant. He didn't answer. In the archives, I found minutes from a town council meeting dated July 14, 1952. The mayor at the time, Arthur Coombe, had raised concerns about the legal status of the Bellgrave family's interment practices. The entry read, "It is disturbing to note that none of the Bellgrave dead are legally recorded. Inquiries made to the family have gone unanswered. Recommendation, no further interference." It was signed and stamped. No one had followed up. No reform proposed. It was as if even government had learned to look away. I returned to the estate with a growing sense of unease. The house seemed to grow larger the longer I studied it. Rooms I hadn't noticed before appeared on the blueprints, but not in person. The eastern wing, previously sealed, now had a single unlocked door. Behind it, a long hallway covered in a faded red runner. The walls bore portraits like before, but these were different, rough, hurried sketches, charcoal smudges of half-finished faces. They were labeled only by years: 1874, 1891, 1913, the most recent, 1997. Each one had a candle holder built into the frame. Every candle had long since melted into thick black puddles. At the end of the hallway was a door with a small wooden plaque, Sanctum. I tried the handle. Beneath the door, a faint draft warm, like breath. I left it alone. That night, I reviewed audio recordings I had captured inside the estate. While I hadn't noticed anything at the time, one particular section stood out. From around 2:06 a.m., there were faint sounds, not quite voices, but not the house settling either. A dragging sound, a low groan, then, for exactly 12 seconds, the whisper. Faint, layered, unintelligible. I slowed the tape, reversed it. Boosted gain. The words that emerged chilled me to the bone. Do not bury what still draws breath. I barely slept. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind against the shuttered windows, seemed laden with intention. At 3:14 a.m., I woke to a rhythmic sound, 4 knocks. Then silence. Then 3. I waited. Then 2. Always in the same pattern. I wrote them down, trying to make sense of them. Code? A countdown? In the morning, I searched the grounds. No sign of tampering. But on the back wall of the estate, near a bramble-covered garden, I discovered something buried in moss and ivy, a stone slab with no inscription. It was roughly 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. Around it, the soil had been disturbed recently. I dug slightly, enough to find an iron ring embedded in the side. Handle. I pulled. The slab moved, revealing a wooden door beneath, sunken and rotting, but still sealed. I didn't open it. Not yet. Back in town, I visited the oldest resident I could find, a woman named Marjorie Bell, age 91, bedridden, and largely unresponsive. But when I mentioned the Bellgraves, she turned her head. They never die, she whispered. They sleep. And the house listens. I asked her what that meant. She repeated it over and over. They never die. They sleep. And the house listens. Later, I received an anonymous note at the library. It was folded between pages of a book I hadn't touched, Architectures of Mourning. Inside, the note read in a looping script, "There was a funeral once. It was a mistake." She woke up screaming. They never tried again. That night, I returned to the estate. I stood by the hidden slab until nightfall, unsure if I was there to investigate or to confirm something I already feared. The Bellgraves didn't hold funerals not because they rejected death, but because death, to them, was not a certainty. It was a threshold that could be postponed, suspended, controlled. As I turned back toward the house, I saw it for the first time, a figure in the upstairs window, still, watching, not quite shadow, not quite light. And in that moment, I understood funerals are for closure, for letting go. But the Bellgraves were never let go. They remained. It had always been there, just past the upper landing of the eastern staircase, an unassuming wooden door, flaked in pale gray paint and bordered by curling wallpaper. I'd passed it several times without noticing anything unusual. The Bellgrave estate was full of locked spaces. After all, relics of a once lavish household folded under decades of disuse. But what drew my attention on the 4th day was the sound. Faint, irregular. A kind of pulsing knock, too slow to be urgent, too rhythmic to be casual. A knock that came not from someone wanting to be let in, but from something waiting to be let out. I recorded it, though the sound barely registered through the thick oak. The door itself was curiously flush with the wall. No light spilled beneath it, and the brass knob had long since corroded into a useless green-veined lump. I traced my hand across its surface and felt, unmistakably, warmth, just enough to jolt the nerves. And something else, a deep indentation, hidden beneath a warped portion of the frame. 5 narrow grooves. Fingernail marks, like someone had once clawed at the wood, not in panic, but deliberately over time. Downstairs, I returned to the blueprints. The room was listed in old estate plans from 1893 as the withdrawing room, though no purpose was indicated. In later architectural surveys from the 1950s, the space was labeled simply as unavailable. In the most recent documents, dated 1994, the room was missing entirely, its square footage seemingly absorbed into the adjacent hall, as if it had been erased from the house on purpose. I asked myself then, why would a room be deliberately forgotten? In the attic, under a sheet of decayed muslin, I discovered a trunk filled with old belongings, brittle gloves, letters burned halfway through, and a child's wooden toy carved in the shape of a stag. Beneath these sat a small leather-bound journal. The cover bore no title, only the initials EB. The entries were scattered, the ink faded and shaky. But one phrase recurred, scrawled several times in jagged repetition. She knocks when she's ready. Don't answer too early. Don't answer too late. I set the journal aside and descended the stairs, drawn again to that door. That evening, I placed a chair opposite the room and waited. From 10 p.m. until well past midnight, nothing occurred. The air grew cold, heavier with each passing hour. But at exactly 1:12 a.m., the sound came again, 4 distinct knocks, followed by silence. Then 3, then 2, then disturbingly 1. I stood, moved closer, placed my hand on the warm wood, and then I heard it. Not from the other side of the door, but from inside the walls, low, muffled breathing, deep, rhythmic, as though the house itself was asleep, or worse, keeping something asleep. I didn't open the door that night. Instead, I returned to town and visited the municipal records office. After enough cajoling and a discreet donation, I was granted access to the private census logs of 1910 to 1930, documents never digitized, kept in locked drawers under faded tape and yellowed tags. There, I found something peculiar. The Bellgrave family population changed drastically between 1915 and 1918. 8 names disappeared, no deaths listed, no marriage transfers. Just gone. One name, however, appeared for the first time in 1919, Eloise Bellgrave, age unknown, residence unlisted, status, undocumented dependent. She was never mentioned again. Back at the estate, I stood once more before the door. It had not moved. No new sounds, no drafts, but something had changed. Taped to the door frame was a scrap of brittle parchment, likely slipped under during the night. It was stained, ink faint but legible. The door is not locked to keep you out. It is locked to keep her within the proper hour. It was signed with only a single character. That night, I dreamed I was inside the room. The walls were too close, the ceiling too low. There were mirrors everywhere, but I couldn't see my own reflection. Only a pale girl, sitting on the floor, her head tilted back at an unnatural angle. Her mouth was open, but she wasn't speaking. She was listening to something behind her. I tried to move closer. That's when I realized my feet were buried in salt. I woke up with the taste of iron on my tongue and a pounding behind my eyes. The next day, I made the decision to open the door. I found an old master key hanging from a rusted hook in the cellar, hidden behind a false panel in a wine rack. On the ring was a single tag, withdrawing room caution. I waited until the sun was at its peak, the fog temporarily broken by a rare beam of pale light. I turned the key. The door opened silently. No creak, no resistance. Inside was darkness, absolute and unnatural. The room's dimensions were wrong, larger than the outside should have allowed. The wallpaper peeled in thin, curling sheets, patterned with deer antlers and lilies. In the center sat a single wooden chair facing away from the door, and atop it, a folded shawl of black lace. No one else. I stepped inside. The air was different, warmer, but not with life. It smelled of dust, old perfume, and something else, salt, perhaps. The breathing sound returned, soft and steady, but it no longer came from the walls. It came from above. I looked up. There was no ceiling, just blackness, thick and endless. I stepped back instinctively, and as I did, I felt the floor give beneath one foot, not collapse but flex, as though I were walking on something not entirely solid or alive. The walls whispered then, not in words, not yet, just suggestion. The sound of turning pages, distant weeping, and something like wind that moved without source. I turned to leave and froze. The door had vanished. The entryway was no longer behind me. Instead, another wall, seamless, as though I had never entered, as though the room had always existed around me, and I had only just noticed. Then I heard her voice, not from there, but from inside my own mouth. "Now you've answered. Let's see if you're early or too late." I screamed, but only in the inside of my mind, because when I tried to move, I realized the salt had returned, and I couldn't feel my legs. I do not remember how I exited the withdrawing room. One moment, I was trapped within a place that bent dimension and language. The next, I was standing at the foot of the stairwell, the dust undisturbed beneath my boots, as though I had never moved. But something had changed. My hands trembled without reason. I had no memory of opening the door. No journal entries from the previous night. The audio recorder in my coat pocket contained only static. Worse yet, the door was sealed once more, warped, flush with the frame. No sign it had ever been opened. It was only when I passed the main hallway that I realized the portraits had changed. There were 6, all mounted in an even row above the grand fireplace in the Bellgrave parlor. I had documented them carefully during my first week. Each canvas a depiction of a former family member in rich oil dark hues. The patriarch Elias, whiz-gloved hands and hunter's eyes. The matron Lenora, hair braided tightly around her crown like a funeral wreath. And the child, Sarah Bellgrave, pale and expressionless, a book clutched in her lap. Each image had been still, preserved, inert. Now they looked back at me. Not in a metaphorical sense. Literally. Their eyes, once painted flat, now contained depth, sheen, direction. I moved slightly to the left. Sarah's painted gaze followed. I stepped right. So did Elias's. Their faces hadn't changed their positions, but the suggestion of life, a presence behind the canvas, was unmistakable. Their expressions had deepened, grown subtly aware. Lenora's mouth now carried the faintest upturn at the edges, not quite a smile, but a hint of recognition. Or warning. I pulled up the photographs I had taken on my phone. In every picture, the expressions remained fixed in their original state. Neutral, blank, unchanging. The digital record contradicted what I saw with my own eyes. Worse, in one photo, the 6th painting, the one I had only glanced at, was entirely blacked out, as if the image refused to be captured. Driven by an instinct I could not name, I ascended the main staircase and turned left into the western hall, where I recalled passing several smaller paintings, less formal, less grand. Family sketches, ancestors perhaps, each framed identically, though smaller in size. I had ignored them before. Now they pulled my attention like magnets. The first was a woman in her 20s, painted in light strokes and pale pastels. She wore a gray dress, high collar, and had no irises, just blank white spheres in her eyes. That I remembered. What I didn't remember was the small boy now standing behind her, half shrouded in shadow. He hadn't been there before. Of that I was sure. I had spent nearly half an hour cataloging this hallway 2 nights ago, and the boy had never existed. Moving to the next portrait, I found a gentleman with a waxed mustache and a cravat. He had been alone in my photographs. Now, there were faint outlines of hands resting on his shoulders. Feminine hands, slender and pale, attached to no visible body. The air in the hallway had grown thick, dense with something more than dust. My breath fogged visibly in front of me. I stepped quickly down the hall, each painting whispering memory I hadn't lived, each canvas rewriting itself in oil and varnish. I stopped before the last portrait, the one at the end of the corridor, once too faded to discern. Now the image was clear. It showed a room, a familiar room, the very hallway in which I stood. And in it, me. The figure wore the same coat, held the same journal. My head was slightly turned, as if I had just noticed the painting for the first time. And behind the painted version of me stood another figure, one I had not seen until now. A woman in black, her eyes hollow, her mouth stretched open far too wide. I turned in real life. The hallway behind me was empty. I ran, down the hall, past the eyes that followed, past the frame that now trembled faintly on its hook. The parlor awaited me below. When I returned to the main portraits, they had changed again. Elias's eyes were closed now. Lenora's mouth had fully curved into a smile. And Sarah? Sarah was no longer seated. Her chair was empty. I began to understand then. These were not just paintings. They were record keepers, containers, portraiture as preservation, each subject bound in pigment and frame. But they were not stable, not sealed. Something was deteriorating. The boundary between representation and reality was thinning. In my sleep that night, I dreamed of paint. Gallons of it poured onto my skin until I couldn't move, until the weight of color became too much to breathe through. I stood before a gilded frame, unable to speak, my limbs arrested mid-motion. People passed by, staring, admiring. None noticed that I was alive inside the canvas, screaming without breath. When I awoke, my hands were streaked with color. Oil pigment, rust red and ivory white, the scent of turpentine on my sleeves. I returned to the portraits in daylight, hoping for rationality. But they had changed again. The sixth canvas, the one I had previously ignored, was no longer empty. A face stared out from it. My face. Not a copy. Not a reproduction. The eyes were mine. The expression mine. The angle, lighting, detail, all precise. Too precise. And there was a date now, etched faintly beneath the frame. March 27, 2025. Tomorrow. The brushwork was still wet. I had begun to tread differently through the Bellgrave estate, no longer as a researcher or visitor, but as something in between, a witness, a participant, a suspect in an unfolding ritual I had never consented to. I kept gloves on now, not to protect myself from the dust, but from contact with the house itself. It felt alive, watching, shifting around me when I wasn't looking. I had taken to marking each threshold I crossed with chalk. By morning, many marks were gone. Some were smudged, others replaced by symbols I had not drawn. It was during one of these inspections that I found a stain. The grand hallway on the second floor, previously unremarkable, bore a dark blot just beneath the central window. Oval-shaped, about a foot in diameter, it looked like a simple water stain at first, aged wood in time. But when I bent closer, the color struck me, too dark for rot, too matte for varnish. I reached out, touched it lightly with gloved fingertips, and withdrew them to find a reddish smear. Dried, but unmistakably blood. I documented it, took samples, and attempted to clean the surface using standard wood soap. It faded slightly, but never fully disappeared. I returned the next day with stronger solvent, something acidic, designed to strip organic residue. It lightened, but only temporarily. By evening, the stain had returned, precisely as before, as if untouched. On the third day, I tried sanding. The stain seeped deeper. The grain of the wood pulled it downward like thirsty veins. Beneath each layer I stripped away, the shape remained, like a wound the house refused to let heal. In the town's historical archives, I searched for incidents involving violence on the Bellgrave property. Nothing emerged. No police records, no emergency dispatches, no gossip columns or whispers in the old newspapers. The house had been silent in public record for over a century. And yet, the stain remained, an echo no one ever spoke of. It wasn't the only one. By the end of the week, I had identified 4 more. One beneath the stairs leading to the withdrawing room. Another near the cellar door. A third in the main parlor, barely visible beneath a frayed oriental rug. And a fourth, far worse than the rest, in the upstairs nursery. This last one was not oval, but radial. A splatter. At its center, a large circular blot. Around it, faint flecks, like something had burst violently. The floorboards had warped slightly in that corner, raised and bowed like ribs under pressure. It was there that I found the second letter. Folded tightly between the slats of the floor, a brittle slip of paper in the same looping handwriting I had seen before. It read, "She came back different." Her mouth was all wrong. We tried to put her back, but the stain stayed. "We keep it fed now." It wasn't signed. The next night, the dreams returned. I walked barefoot through the halls of the house. My steps left prints, not of water or dust, but of blood. Every surface I touched bled. The walls pulsed like lungs. The portraits whispered in languages I didn't recognize. And always the sense of something below. Something breathing beneath the floorboards, patient and hungry. I awoke in a cold sweat, the sheets clinging to me. My feet were bare, and at the base of my bed, a trail of damp footprints. Reddish, still wet. I checked my body for wounds. Nothing. By this point, the Bellgrave estate had become impossible to treat as static architecture. The house had moods. It grew restless at dusk, quiet during storms, and seemed to respond, subtly, maliciously, to my presence. Lights flickered more often in rooms I spent time in. Doors I had locked were found open. The mirrors, those that weren't shattered, sometimes held shapes that did not belong to me. I began to carry a voice recorder at all times, just in case. The audio, once played back, often contained faint static and, on occasion, whispers. One clip repeated a phrase I couldn't make out until I slowed it by 50%. Then it became clear. "Don't wipe it away. It's all we remember." I began to wonder if the stains were memorials. Not just traces of past violence, but active, living memorials. The house preserved them. reapplied them like ritualistic paint. They were not accidents. They were chosen. I contacted a forensic analyst, discreetly through an old colleague, to test the sample I had collected from the hallway floor. A week later, I received an email. The blood was human. Typo. But there was a note of confusion. The protein degradation level is inconsistent with its age, he wrote. It behaves like it's decades old, but structurally it's much fresher. It doesn't match decay rates. It's almost like it's being sustained. Sustained. That word rang through my mind like a tuning fork. I returned to the stains the next morning, now with a hypothesis. I cut my finger carefully and let a single drop fall onto the stain near the window. For a moment, nothing happened. But then the drop was absorbed. Instantly, as if the wood had swallowed it whole. The grain darkened briefly, and then, impossibly, the stain grew darker, richer, as though fed. I stepped back in horror. That evening, the floorboards near the cellar creaked without provocation. I descended the steps and found the lantern I had left there days before flickering brightly. At the center of the cellar floor was a fresh stain, still wet. I hadn't bled there. Someone or something had. I scoured the cellar, found no signs of entry, no open doors, no disturbed dust except for a set of narrow, bare footprints, smaller than mine, leading toward the furnace. And when I opened the rusted iron grate, I found not ash but bone fragments, small, delicate, finger bones. I collapsed the grate shut and fled upstairs. I didn't sleep that night. The Bellgraves had never declared death because perhaps death had never truly happened. Perhaps each loss was merely a transaction, an offering. And the stains weren't remnants. They were agreements, signatures in blood, pages in a contract that had no end. The floorboards remembered. And now so did I. There were very few intact mirrors left in the Bellgrave estate. Most were shattered, their jagged edges tucked into dusty corners like the teeth of some forgotten beast. Others were veiled in heavy velvet or removed entirely, their absence more unsettling than their presence. But in the upper west corridor, near what appeared to be an unused servant's dressing room, I found one hole, tarnished at the edges but intact. It stood 6 feet tall, framed in wrought iron shaped like twisted branches, and leaned against the wall at a crooked angle as though discarded. I nearly walked past it, but then I noticed the reflection. She stood behind me, a woman black-clad, still as oil. Her face was pale and long, features delicate but severe. She wore a mourning veil over tightly bound hair, hands clasped at her waist in a posture of quiet restraint. Her lips did not move. Her eyes did not blink. She was not there when I turned around. Only in the mirror. Always in the mirror. I stared for a long time, trying to convince myself I had misseen, that the light had bent oddly, that my exhausted mind had conjured a shadow. But no, the image was too detailed, too deliberate. I moved to the side. She remained centered, as if the mirror obeyed her orientation, not mine. When I finally stepped away, I noticed something even more disturbing. My own reflection had changed, subtly, terribly. My eyes were a fraction too wide. My expression no longer matched what I felt. The corners of my mouth tilted down slightly, though I was not frowning. My body posture was ever so slightly off, as if the mirror had begun to reflect not what I was, but what I would become. I covered the mirror with an old bedsheet and left the corridor in silence. That evening, I spoke with a woman named Edith Mallory, the granddaughter of the last known Bellgrave housemaid. She agreed to meet at a diner on the edge of town, away from the estate's influence. Her hands trembled as she poured her coffee, and her voice was no more than a whisper when she finally spoke. She used to stand in the mirrors, even before she died, Edith said. Mrs. Agnes Bellgrave, Elias's wife. They said she never stopped mourning their child. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak, just stared, every day, into the mirror at the end of the hall. She said that's where her daughter went. She said Sarah got pulled in. I asked her what happened to Agnes. She walked into the lake, Edith said, wearing her wedding gown, middle of winter. They never found the body. When I told her about the reflection I'd seen, her hands stiffened midair. She slowly placed her coffee down and reached into her purse. She pulled out a crumbling black and white photograph, A portrait of a woman in a long dark dress. Delicate features. Tightly bound hair. "That's her," I whispered. Edith nodded. "But how can she still be there?" I asked. Edith looked out the window. "Because grief leaves anchors. And some anchors don't rust." I returned to the house and stood once again before the mirror. The sheet had fallen away, folded neatly on the floor, though I had tied it tightly that morning. The widow was still there, waiting. But this time, she was closer to the surface. Her face pressed lightly against the inside of the glass. I reached forward, hand trembling, and touched the mirror. Cold radiated through my fingertips, not just surface chill, but a deep grave cold, like soil left unturned for decades. My breath fogged the surface. The widow didn't blink, didn't move. Then, so suddenly I nearly fell back, her head tilted. Just a fraction. But enough. It was a gesture of acknowledgement and warning. I staggered out of the corridor and retreated to the study. I poured through the journals again, especially those marked EB. One entry caught my attention. "She watches now. She never speaks. She reflects what we buried, what we deny. She is the grief we refuse to feel." Another read. "The glass cracked only once, when someone tried to look away. That night, I placed a camera before the mirror and let it record as I slept. In the morning, I reviewed the footage. For the first 2 hours, nothing. Then precisely at 3:03 a.m., movement. The image in the mirror rippled slightly, and then she stepped forward. Not walked, stepped. As if from a room behind the mirror into the space just beneath the surface. Her veil fluttered slightly. Her lips parted. Her mouth was wrong, too large, too dark, and when she opened it, no sound emerged, only a distortion in the video feed like static in the air. At 3:04, the camera died. No power surge. No battery failure. Just off. I retrieved the device. It was warm to the touch. The lens fogged from the inside. I tried to leave the estate that afternoon. I packed a bag and drove into town. But the road twisted unexpectedly. Signs disappeared. The GPS turned blank. After an hour, I realized I had returned to the gate. The house had pulled me back. Inside, the mirrors had multiplied. Ones I was sure didn't exist before. Above the staircase. In the dining room. Even a shard in the drawer of the writing desk. Each one showed her. Always in black. Always silent. Always waiting. In desperation, I smashed the first mirror. Glass scattered like ice across the floor. But in the reflection of a nearby window, she remained unchanged. I came to understand then. She was no longer inside the glass. The mirror was a gate, yes, but it had become unnecessary. Her grief had seeped through the frame and saturated the house itself. Every surface reflected her now. Every silence echoed her mourning. She was not merely a ghost. She was mourning given form. A wail stretched across generations, too deep to be heard, too old to be undone. That night, I did not sleep. I could feel her behind me, always behind me, never touching, never speaking, but present. The way grief follows you through every hallway of your life. When morning finally broke, I found a single message scrawled on the mirror's fogged glass. "Where is my daughter?" And beneath it, a red streak, as though written in blood dragged by a fingertip. I had no answer, only questions. And in the reflection, her mouth began to move. The first letter appeared the morning after the message on the mirror. I found it lying precisely at the foot of my bed, resting atop the faded rug as though delicately placed by a hand that no longer trembled. The envelope was a dusty beige, the corners curled with age, but the paper itself was not yellowed. It smelled of damp earth and something faintly sweet, decay softened by rosewater. There was no postage, no return address, only my name on the front, not my title, not Mr. or Doctor, but my first name handwritten in a flowing, unfamiliar script. Inside, the paper was damp and gritty. I brushed away a few flecks of soil that fell loose from the folds. The letter read, "You came with eyes open." They never did. They only covered and dug. But you listen. You stay still when the house breathes. You are close now. Keep listening. And dig only when told. It was signed again, with a single letter. I turned it over. The back of the page was stained in a shape I recognized immediately, the same silhouette as the growing bloodstain near the cellar. A subtle but spreading form, like a dark flower blooming in silence. Something about the ink didn't feel applied by pen. It felt pushed forward. I stored the letter in my field notebook and tried to convince myself this was the work of a disturbed squatter or town eccentric, someone manipulating me, feeding off my paranoia. But the second letter removed all doubt. It came the next morning, same position, same envelope, but this time it was wet, soaked through with blackish water, the ink running like tears. I opened it with care, revealing smeared words, barely legible. She is buried in time, not in ground. That is the first lie. You must look beneath, not the house, but the date. They marked the day with a bell, but they rang it too late. The ground kept her memory, not her body. This one wasn't signed, but embedded in the damp page was a small red thread, unnaturally bright, almost fresh. I examined it under magnification. It was hair. A single red strand of hair woven through the pulp of the paper. That same day, I returned to the Bellgrave library and began digging through the family almanac, a tattered book written in a mix of Latin and archaic English. It contained odd notations, star charts, seasonal rituals. One entry stood out: April 17th, ring the morning bell at dawn. Ring once for the lost. Ring twice if found. 3 if returned. Never 4. Never 4. The line was repeated, and in one corner, an ink blot where someone had tried to erase a 4th ring. The house had a bell tower. I had seen it during my first arrival, but assumed it was ornamental. Now I realized it had a mechanism hidden within the 3rd floor rafters. I climbed the narrow steps, flashlight in hand. Dust motes choked the air, and the passage grew tighter with each turn. At the top, I found the bell, massive iron, weather-stained but intact. A thick rope hung from its mechanism, frayed from disuse. I didn't ring it. I didn't need to. The rope was damp. Someone had already rung it. That night, a 3rd letter arrived. This one was different. Heavier. When I opened the envelope, a fine cascade of dirt spilled out, enough to stain the rug and coat my hands. The letter read, "You walk above the truth. Beneath the garden is the real memory. It is not soil. It is pages, written in marrow. Dig gently. She is still reading." I went outside just after midnight, lantern in hand, and stood at the edge of the Bellgrave garden. It was overgrown with thorny hedges and gray-rooted trees that twisted like vertebrae. The soil was dense and dry on the surface, but yielded quickly beneath. I dug carefully near the center, just past the broken sundial, using a hand trowel. 6 inches down, I struck parchment. Not paper skin. A sheet of something preserved in wax, inscribed with names and dates. It crackled as I lifted it. On its surface were a dozen fingerprints in dried blood, arranged in a circle. At the center, a child's name, Sarah Bellgrave, and beneath it, a phrase, unmarked, unmissed, unstilled. My stomach turned. I kept digging. Beneath that sheet were more. Pages upon pages, all preserved in the same horrifying way. Some were stitched together with sinew, others bound with brittle cord. Each bore writing, some ink, some in blood, some in carvings so deep they had torn through. And beneath it all, a single wooden box, child-sized. I hesitated, then opened it. It was empty. No bones, no clothes, only an indentation where something once rested. And inside the lid, scrawled hastily, were the words, "She read too far ahead." We couldn't close the book. I filled the grave back in. My hand shook the entire time. When I returned to my room, there was a 4th letter waiting. This one was already opened. "She sees you now. She read your name today." The letters will stop, but the story continues. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floor sounded like approaching footsteps. Every rustle of the trees outside whispered syllables I couldn't understand. I turned on every light. It made no difference. In the mirror, she had moved again. Closer. And this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a figure I recognized too late, myself. Or some version of me, blurred and weathered, eyes hollow and lips sewn shut, holding a letter in one hand, reaching out with the other. I dropped the mirror. It did not break. Instead, it rippled. and from the center, the red thread slowly pushed itself through the glass, 1 inch at a time, like a bookmark reaching from one side of the story into the next. The letters had stopped, but the ground kept writing, and now it was using me. It had not been cataloged in any of the estate's inventories. I found it by accident, or rather, it found me. I was searching the dining room for signs of loose floorboards when I noticed the sideboard had been moved. A heavy oak fixture, too large for one person to shift casually. Behind it, the wall bore a rectangular indentation, a hidden compartment. No hinges, just a slight outline in the plaster and the smell of soot. I pried it open with a fire poker. Inside was a single item wrapped in moth-eaten cloth, a thick leather-bound book sealed with a rusted clasp. Upon its cracked cover, in gold leaf that had faded almost to dust, were the words, "The Bellgrave Testament." It wasn't a Bible, at least not in any traditional sense. There were familiar phrases at first, passages from Genesis, Psalms, Revelation, but they were incomplete, fragmented, rearranged. In many places, they had been altered completely. Words had been changed. Entire verses redacted with thick lines of ink or scratched out with a blade. Scrawled beside them, in different handwriting across decades, were annotations, corrections, and warnings. One margin note read, "He breathed life into clay, but the Bellgraves breathed into dust. Dust remembers more." Another read, "Do not pray aloud in the east wing. She listens through the walls." I turned the brittle pages slowly, careful not to break the binding. Tucked inside the book were additions, sheets of aged paper glued onto the original parchment, handwritten in what I assumed were the inked confessions of various Bellgrave ancestors. Each page seemed more unhinged than the last. The further I read, the more the text dissolved from scripture into something else. Rituals, recipes, instructions. One section was titled, "The Body Must Not Cool." Beneath it was a detailed process for preserving human flesh with salt, honey, and crushed lilies. It ended with, "Seal the mouth with wax. Bind the feet in prayer. The soul will not rise, but the voice may answer." Another segment, titled "To Distill Memory," described an elaborate ritual involving mirrors, repeated names, and a child's first tooth. It was marked with a symbol I had seen once before, carved into the cellar beams. A circle with a vertical line through its center, intersected by 3 arcs. The Bellgrave sigil I now understood. Not a crest, but a seal. A warning. I turned the page and froze. There was a family tree drawn in ink, carefully rendered, but incomplete. It began in the 1700s and stopped in 1997. The last name on the page was Sarah Bellgrave. No birth date, no death. Just her name, surrounded by a box instead of a line. And beside it, written in sharp script, the line pauses. The echo remains. Underneath that, scribbled in red pencil, was something I hadn't expected. "He stays in the garden. She waits in the glass. The child is the key." I remembered the empty child-sized box I had found beneath the sundial. The implication made my stomach lurch. This family had rewritten sacred texts, memorialized the dead not as gone, but as dormant, and treated resurrection not as miracle, but as tradition. They did not believe in death. They cataloged it, prepared for its return. At the back of the testament was a locked section. The clasp was smaller, newer, as if replaced in recent years. But the key was missing. I tried several from the house's master ring, none fit. The pages beneath the clasp were thicker, gilded at the edge, and I could see from the spine that there were markings inside. Images, maybe. I was considering how best to force the lock when I noticed a loose ribbon tucked into the binding. I pulled it. A hidden flap in the cover opened, revealing a flat, bone-colored object. A key. I hesitated for a long time before using it. There was something final about crossing into this part of the book, as though each chapter of the testament had been testing my resolve. I turned the key. The clasp opened with a soft click, and the pages fell free. Inside were illustrations, not drawn, but printed with an uncanny precision. Diagrams of human figures, cross-sections of skulls, labeled not with anatomical terms, but with phrases like reverberation chamber, anchor point, and hollow for return. The final image was that of a cradle, empty, with arrows pointing inward. The label beneath it, "Memory must enter here first, before the soul can follow." And then the most recent page, a list of names written in cramped, looping script. Each name was followed by a series of actions. Thomas Bellgrave burned. Returned incomplete. Lenora Bellgrave submerged. Voice recovered. Elias Bellgrave buried breathing. Lives beneath. Sarah Bellgrave unfinished. Do not disturb. And at the bottom, a final note. If another reads this, they have already joined. The testament rewrites the reader. The pages are not passive. You have left yourself behind. I slammed the book shut. The room grew cold immediately. Not a breeze, not a draft, but a vacuum, as though the house had drawn in breath and held it. The fireplace extinguished. The windows, previously grimy and dull, now reflected something they hadn't before. Behind me, the widow, Agnes, standing just outside the circle of shadow cast by the chandelier. In the reflection, she moved forward. In reality, the room remained still. I turned, nothing. But in the mirror, she reached out, placing one gloved hand on my shoulder. And then I heard the whisper, close enough to stir the hairs on my neck. You read it. Now you remember. We all remember. The testament had not just recorded memory. It had preserved it. In ink, in blood, in me. The phrase had appeared again and again, first in passing, then with mounting insistence. Not dead, only sleeping. I had dismissed it initially as metaphor, the kind of sentimental inscription one finds on headstones from centuries past. But in the Bellgrave context, the phrase was literal. I had read enough now, uncovered enough to understand that the Bellgraves did not view death as an ending. They treated it as a phase, a state to be prolonged, interrupted, reversed. They did not bury their dead, they contained them. I returned to the locked eastern wing of the house, previously bricked over, its door sealed with 3 iron bolts and a plank of nailed wood. The floor plan labeled it only as the vestibule. Now that I had the master key and the testament's map tucked into my coat pocket, I knew there was more behind that door than old furniture. The testament described it in hushed terms, like a sacred chamber, the vestibule, for those not yet gone, where breath lingers and the veil is gauze. It took the better part of 2 hours to remove the boards. The wood resisted with a strange tenacity, creaking not like furniture, but like something in pain. Once inside, the air hit me like a wave, stale, warm, and faintly metallic. It smelled like rust and dried sweat, like old hospitals and sealed crypts. The corridor beyond was narrow, lined with stone instead of wood, and lit by old oil sconces that should not have worked. But as I passed, they flickered to life. Automatically. Expectantly. The hall ended at a heavy iron door with a circular handle in the center, like a vault. I turned it. Slowly, grindingly, it gave. The chamber inside was cold and vast, an underground sanctum lit by low-hanging bulbs that swung slightly in an unseen breeze. There were beds, dozens of them, all identical, wrought iron frames with white linens, perfectly made, undisturbed. On each pillow sat a placard bearing a name. Elias, Lenora, Thomas, several names I didn't recognize. The dates below were unsettling, birth dates without death dates. And on one cot, farthest from the others, the placard read Sarah Bellgrave. No dates, no titles, just the name. The beds were not empty. Each was occupied. Bodies lay under the sheets, still and pale, their hands folded over their chests. Not corpses, at least not in the traditional sense. Their faces were too intact. Skin pale, but supple. Eyes shut but not sunken. Mouths closed gently, without the slackness of true death. They looked like wax figures. Or sleepers. The machines confirmed it. Each bed had a rudimentary monitoring device. Analog, ancient, but somehow operational. A series of dials and needles measured something not quite heartbeat, not quite breath. One dial, marked resonance, fluttered gently in a rhythmic pulse. I watched in disbelief as it moved in sync across all beds, except one. Sarah's remained still, but her eyes were open. Just slightly. A slit of blue glimmering through her lids. I backed away, breath catching in my throat. These weren't graves. This was storage. A preservation chamber for those the family refused to let go. They had sustained their bloodline not by breeding, but by stalling death. A continuous suspension, holding their own between life and its final threshold. They weren't waiting to die. They were waiting to return. I thought of the phrase again, not dead, only sleeping, and realized it wasn't comforting. It was threatening. These were not lives paused out of grief, but out of control. Mastery over death, stolen from nature and rewritten through ritual. I approached one of the monitoring devices and studied its wiring. Each was powered by a thick copper line leading into the wall. No visible generator. I followed the cables to a steel box mounted near the ceiling. It buzzed softly, and from inside I heard a ticking sound. A metronome. And layered beneath it, so soft I thought I was imagining it. What a voice. Repeating something like a lullaby. I pressed my ear to the box. Rest but don't release. Sleep but don't dream. Lie still and remain. Return when called. It was a recording. Old, grainy. A woman's voice. Agnes, the widow. She hadn't walked into the lake. She had been guiding them ever since. Her mourning had become function. She was the voice that kept them still. The Bellgraves hadn't simply built a legacy. They had constructed a loop, a family tree that folded back onto itself, refusing the natural decay of memory and flesh. I looked down again at Sarah. Her head had turned slightly. No, facing me. No expression. Just awareness. I stumbled backward, knocking into a nearby cot. The body upon it, a man I recognized from one of the portraits, twitched. Just once. A single, sudden jerk, like a muscle spasm in a leg. But the monitors didn't react. The breath wasn't measurable. It was will. I fled the chamber, sealing the vault behind me. I marked the doorway again with chalk, but the mark vanished within minutes. Back in my room, the mirror had fogged over despite no temperature change. In the fog, a handprint. Small. Child-sized. The red thread had reappeared, coiled neatly on my pillow. That night, I dreamed of Sarah. She stood at the center of the vestibule, her eyes wide open now, her mouth moving. But no sound escaped. Around her stood the others, each slowly rising from their beds, watching me without blinking. The walls pulsed like lungs. The floor heaved like flesh. And all around, a whisper passed from mouth to mouth. We were never dead, only waiting for the one who would read. When I woke, the testament lay open on my desk again. This time, a new name had been added. Mine. There was always another layer to the Bellgrave estate, another corridor behind a wall, another truth behind a whispered phrase. But the vault was different. It was not part of the house, not really. It existed beneath, separate in tone and atmosphere, sealed away by design. The testament referenced it only once, in a marginal note scrawled in faded red ink. When the above fails, the below remembers. That is where they are truly kept. The cellar, which I had long assumed was the estate's lowest point, was only the beginning. At the far end, behind a row of rusted shelves stacked with mildewed linens and broken furniture, I found a sliver of brick wall that rang hollow when struck. I chipped at it with a chisel, the dust choking and gray. After a few hours of careful work, the shape of a door emerged, arched, narrow, framed in cold iron. No handle, only an indentation the shape of a palm. I placed my hand against it. Nothing happened. I remembered then the family tree in the testament. The sigil that appeared next to Sarah's name, and now beside mine. A mark not just of lineage, but of entry. The book was more than a record. It was a key. I retrieved the testament, opened it to the page bearing my name, and placed it against the indentation. The metal warmed under my hand, then released with a low click. The door groaned inward. A staircase descended into blackness. The air shifted as I stepped down, cool, damp, and charged with a static weight that settled in my bones. The steps were stone, worn smooth by time, and the deeper I went, the more the sounds of the house faded. After 100 steps, I could no longer hear the wind. After 200, not even my own breath echoed. At the bottom stood the vault, a vast cavern carved directly into the bedrock, its ceiling lost in shadow. There were no lights, but still I could see. The walls shimmered with some internal phosphorescence, faint and bluish, like moonlight seen through deep water. The floor was tiled with bones, not piled, not scattered, but laid flat and meticulously arranged in spiraling patterns. Femurs, ribs, vertebrae, forming rings upon rings. In the center of the chamber was a dais. Upon it stood 7 stone coffins, each marked with the Bellgrave sigil. But unlike the sleepers above, these were not laid in peace. Chains wrapped each coffin, iron links wound tightly around the lids, sealed with wax and old blood. Each bore a symbol I didn't recognize, sigils that pulsed faintly when I approached. At the foot of the dais sat a lectern. Upon it lay a book much older than the Testament. Its cover was cracked stone, its pages of some leathery parchment too thick to be animal hide. It opened as I touched it, its ink black and glistening, as though freshly written. There were no words, only images. A spiral swallowing a tree. A woman with no mouth and hands stretched to the sky. A house bleeding from its windows. And then a depiction that chilled me more than all the rest. A man with my face, standing in the very vault I now occupied, holding the book open as the coffins behind him cracked open. I slammed the book shut. A low groan trembled through the chamber, vibrating in the bones beneath my feet. The chains rattled, softly at first, then louder, as though stirred by breath returning to lungs long dormant. From somewhere beyond the dais came a sound I had come to fear, the slow, deliberate knock. 4 times, then 3, then 2, then I ran. Up the stairs, heart hammering, breath torn from my lungs, the sound of metal links dragging across stone following close behind. The vault door did not resist as I slammed it shut behind me. I pressed my entire weight against it and waited. Silence, but not stillness. The house above had changed. The walls throbbed slightly, like something had been awakened deep beneath the foundation. As I stumbled back into the hallway, the chandeliers swayed though there was no breeze. The portraits had all turned to face me. In my room, the Testament was gone. In its place was the stone-covered book from the vault. I didn't bring it up. I didn't carry it. It came on its own. The pages flipped open of their own accord, revealing a new image. The Bellgrave estate, engulfed in fire, black smoke curling toward sky without stars. And within the flames, the 7 sealed coffins, open now empty. The spiral beneath them turning like a clock. I turned away. But every mirror in the room had fogged, and within each stood the widow, her veil lifted, her mouth sewn shut. She raised one hand, slowly, and pointed downward. Back to the vault. Back to the sleepers beneath the sleepers. I understood then, the chamber above had been a deception. A deal. Those bodies, the ones preserved in linen and monitored by machines, were sacrifices. Placeholders. The real Bellgraves were buried deeper, older. Bound not by blood or lineage, but by oath. And I had broken the seal. That night, I felt the first tremor. It came through the floorboards, subtle as a sigh. Then, at precisely 3:03 a.m., I heard a voice whisper from the wall beside my bed. The vault is open, and with it, a second voice. We are not dead. We are not done. The town of Grey Marrow had always seemed indifferent to the estate's dark presence, content to let the Bellgraves exist on their hill like a secret kept in plain sight. But after I opened the vault, after the book from the dais appeared in my room, something changed. The indifference soured into a quiet dread. People no longer met my eyes in town. Doors locked a little earlier. The few remaining locals who had spoken to me before now crossed the street when I passed. I had not told anyone what I had seen. I didn't need to. They already knew. It began with whispers, rumors that sounded like urban legend, shared by cashiers and bartenders under their breath, always phrased as questions. Did you hear old Peter Langley swears he saw his brother last week? But Henry died in '85, didn't he? Or Eleanor Hawthorne said someone knocked on her door at midnight. She swears it was her husband. But he's been gone since the flood. At first I dismissed them as grief hallucinations or guilt-fueled dreams. But then I saw it for myself. On the corner of Bell and Morrow Streets, beside the long-abandoned tailor shop, a young girl in a blue dress stood beside a man in old-fashioned suspenders. His face was gray, pale, eyes sunk too deep. He leaned down to whisper in her ear. She nodded, smiled faintly, and then they walked hand in hand toward the hill. I followed, but by the time I reached the bend in the road, they were gone. No footprints, no breeze, only the lingering scent of lilac, Sarah Bellgrave's perfume, if the Testament annotations were to be believed. The next day, I visited the town records office and pulled every missing persons report for the last 70 years. There weren't many. Grey Marrow was small, sleepy, the kind of place where people either stayed or were remembered for leaving. But between 1940 and 1997, 17 people had disappeared, most of them under circumstances labeled as unresolved departure. No evidence of abduction, no trace of struggle. They had simply walked away. Cross-referencing their family trees with those in the testament revealed something chilling. Every one of them had a blood tie to the Bellgraves, distant cousins, half-siblings, adopted children. The family had scattered its roots deep into the town's veins, and now something was calling them back. That night, I heard the bell. Faint, in the distance, one long ring, then silence. Then 2, then 3, but never 4. I looked out my window. The mist over Bellgrave Hill was glowing faintly, as though lit from below. Shadows moved within it, not figures, but outlines. People walking toward the house, silent and slow, like pilgrims returning to a long-forgotten temple. Some came alone, others in pairs. All were pale, dressed in old styles, fashioned from other decades. Many barefoot. Most looked like they hadn't spoken in years. The reunions were quiet. No celebration. No recognition beyond a look. Families reunited across generations with no warmth, no weeping. Just the acceptance of a tide returned. I saw one woman kneel in the yard before a man who had been declared dead in 1972. She placed her hand on his chest. He did not speak. He placed his hand on her head and then turned toward the house. She did not follow. They never stayed. Each visitor entered the house with purpose. They walked the halls without hesitation. They knew where to go. I found one in the kitchen, staring out the window. His mouth was stitched shut. His eyes moved slowly, following some unseen path beyond the glass. When I stepped forward, he turned his head, looked at me, not with hostility, but with recognition. He nodded once, then turned and disappeared through a door that hadn't been there before. Later, I found the room he'd entered. It was empty. Only dust and old air. The house had begun absorbing them again. That morning, I found a new entry in the testament, one that hadn't existed the day before. The pages had written themselves, I was certain. There, below Sarah's box name and my own, were 17 new entries, each with the date of their original disappearance. Each marked, returned. Their entries ended with a phrase I had come to dread. Not dead, only sleeping. Now waking. The town could no longer pretend. A woman screamed in the post office when a man she'd buried 30 years ago tried to hand her a letter. He didn't speak, just stood there, the envelope held forward, eyes unblinking. The woman fainted. The man vanished. I approached the sheriff, hoping for some explanation, any reaction beyond silence. He looked at me, eyes tired, and said, "They always come back when the vault opens. That's why we stopped going up there." When I asked why no one warned me, he shrugged. Would you have believed us? The quiet reunions grew less quiet as the week went on. Some of the returned began knocking at doors, standing in gardens, waiting outside schools, always watching, never speaking. Some appeared in reflections, bathroom mirrors, shop windows, pond water. Their images would hold your gaze, follow your steps. They didn't interfere. They simply reminded. They made sure no one forgot. And yet, they brought no destruction. No overt violence. Their presence was suffocating, yes, but not hostile. They didn't want revenge. They wanted place, acknowledgement. They were returning not as conquerors, but as tenants, reclaiming homes built on their memory. But there was one exception. Sarah. She did not wander. She remained in the house, but her influence spread. Each time I passed a mirror, her eyes were closer. Each time I opened the testament, her name bled faintly through the page, soaking into others. When I heard the bell now, I could also hear her breath, rasping, shallow, as though her sleep was breaking. I began to understand the reunions were not the end. They were preparation. Sarah was the key. She had not been buried. She had been suspended, held, contained. And the quiet reunions were not just visitations. They were a calling, a gathering, a ceremony of return. The house was filling, and Sarah would be the one to speak first. By the 12th night after the vault opened, the house no longer belonged to me or to the living. It pulsed with a rhythm not unlike breath, a slow inhalation and exhalation that echoed through the walls at dusk and again before dawn. Lights flickered without cause. Doors closed behind me without sound. The sound of soft footsteps could be heard at all hours, though I often walked the hallways alone. And when I wasn't alone, I was never entirely sure who or what was standing with me. The quiet reunions were only the beginning. What came next was lineage. Names. Blood. In the basement, behind a cabinet I hadn't noticed before, I found a narrow passage leading to a cramped stone alcove. There was a table in the center, and a box atop it. The box was locked, but beside it lay a list, pinned in two distinct hands. One shaky, looping, the other precise and deliberate. It was a roster of names, organized not by birth, but by proximity to the root, as the header read. The Bellgrave family had not just recorded ancestry, they had ranked it, placed it in orbit around a central, invisible core. And some names had been crossed out, not erased, condemned. Burned at the edges, ink slashed through the center. Names that had betrayed something, or perhaps names that had failed to return. At the bottom of the list, beneath the final recorded name, someone had written in red, "The heir is not born, but chosen by memory. The house remembers more than blood." I realized then what the house had been doing. Watching me, judging me, weighing me not as a trespasser, but as a candidate. I had read the testament. I had opened the vault. I had spoken her name. And in doing so, I had invited their history into mine. Back upstairs, in the hallway where the portraits once watched passively, I found several blank canvases added to the gallery wall. Fresh wood, untouched linen, but each one had a nameplate. Not engraved, not yet, but scratched in faint graphite. One bore my name. The others were left blank. I approached the canvas with my name and touched it. The surface was warm. Later that day, I searched the attic. The floorboards were warped with moisture, but something called me upward. In the far corner, behind an old wardrobe, I found a child's writing desk. A faded note pinned to its surface read, "For the second Sarah." Inside the drawers were drawings. Crude sketches in crayon and pencil, houses with many windows, black trees, people without mouths. In one drawing, the family stood in a circle, holding hands. In the center was a spiral. Beneath the spiral, a girl curled in the fetal position. The caption read, "We are the night, and she is the hollow." I finally understood the term that had appeared so often in the Testament, Hollow Night. It wasn't a time. It was a title. A position passed through the family like a crown, worn not on the head but in the marrow. A title not inherited by seniority or bloodline, but by invitation. And the heir of the Hollow Knight was not born. They were made. Every few generations, the Bellgraves had chosen a vessel. Someone to embody their history, to carry the burden of memory. Someone to stay when others went quiet. Sarah had been the last, and I was being prepared to be the next. That night, the dreams returned. I stood in the Bellgrave dining room, though it was grander now, restored to its original glory. The table was full, every chair occupied by a face I'd seen in portraits: Elias, Lenora, Thomas. The widow sat at the head, and beside her a space, an empty seat waiting. She looked at me, lifted her hand, and gestured toward it. When I sat, the others bowed their heads, and I felt something slide into place behind my eyes. I woke in my bed, soaked with sweat, mouth full of soil. At dawn, I found a message scrawled across the bedroom mirror, etched in condensation. The house does not choose lightly, but it does choose. Downstairs, in the vestibule chamber, the sleepers remained as they had, but one cot was gone. Sarah's bed. The sheets folded, the placard removed. She was no longer there. The spiral beneath the bed glowed faintly. A new name had appeared in the Testament's final page of mine again, but with a second inscription beneath. Heir apparent. Memory aligned. I wanted to run, to flee the estate, the town, the fog-drenched hill. But every attempt failed. Roads bent unnaturally. Signs changed orientation. My car would not start. Phones refused signal. Even maps blurred when I tried to trace routes away from the estate. I wasn't just being watched. I was being kept. One morning, I awoke to the sound of a lullaby playing from an unseen source, soft, distant, the same one I had heard faintly in the vault. When I opened the bedroom door, a child stood at the end of the hallway. pale, barefoot, her hair red and tangled. She held a book in her hands, a stone-covered testament. "Do you want to read with me?" she asked. I shook my head. "You already are," she whispered, then turned and vanished through a wall that had never opened before. The estate had opened itself entirely now. No doors were locked, no corridors hidden. The architecture bent inward, reshaping to fit my steps. I found rooms I had never seen, bearing my belongings, arranged as if I had always lived there. A cradle, a study, a dressing room. The house was anticipating. And outside, more of the town had begun to visit. They arrived at night, quietly, not knocking, not intruding, just standing on the lawn, looking up at the house, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight, watching, waiting, reassured. Their heir had been found. The hollow night had returned, and in the mirror I saw myself, not as I was, but as I would become. There had always been sounds in the house. The groaning of timber as temperature shifted, the hollow knock of wind funneling through broken chimneys, the soft skittering of rodents across attic beams. But those were the noises of an old building, mundane and mechanical. These sounds, what I heard now, were different. They were rhythmic, measured, purposeful. They were breathing. It began subtly, a shallow exhalation from beneath my bed, so faint I mistook it for the sound of my own lungs. But one night, after I held my breath in absolute silence, the exhale continued, slow, wet, drawn from a place deeper than lungs. And it came not only from below, but from within the walls, the stairs, the very structure of the Bellgrave estate. The house wasn't just echoing noise, it was inhaling it, responding, mimicking. At first I feared I was losing my mind. Sleep had become elusive, dreams fractured by glimpses of eyes and floor cracks, fingers curling through wooden slats. I would wake gasping, always with the sense that something had been listening to me sleep. The mattress would feel subtly disturbed. The pillows shifted as if shared. And then came the movement. Floorboards that flexed beneath my steps when I wasn't stepping. Planks that bowed inward when no weight was applied. At night, I began to see the rise and fall of the floor, as though the house were gently breathing beneath its wooden skin. The swell of invisible lungs, housed in the foundation. I placed a glass of water on the floor beside my bed one evening and watched as it rippled faintly every 5 seconds. The walls, too, began to pulse, just enough to be noticed, just enough to suggest the walls themselves had become tissue. When I pressed my ear to the paneling, I could hear a faint thump, not like pipes or rodents. It was a heartbeat. The Bellgraves were no longer confined to the crypts or chambers. They had diffused into the house. Their essence had soaked into the framework. Memory, once kept in books and portraits, had now become biological. The house itself was alive, and it wanted me to know it. One morning, I discovered footprints in the dust of the hallway outside my room. Bare, small, staggered. A child's feet. They led to the library, where every book had been pulled from the shelves and stacked into a spiral. At the center was the testament, open to a blank page. A message slowly forming as if by invisible hand. We do not sleep in beds anymore. We sleep in beams, in nails, in floorboards, in you. I staggered back, heart racing, and accidentally kicked over one of the books. Beneath it, scrawled in chalk directly onto the floor, was a diagram of the estate. Each room labeled not by function, but by sensation, hunger, regret, mourning, hollow. The room I slept in was labeled succession. The breathing intensified that night. I could feel it in my bones, soft vibrations with each inhale and exhale, timed with my own heartbeat. The rhythm became impossible to ignore. Every time I tried to slow my pulse, the house matched me. Every time I panicked, it accelerated. It wasn't just listening anymore. It was sinking. I pulled up the floorboards in desperation, expecting to find rot or mold, rats perhaps, but instead I found flesh. Not literal, but a surface that looked like skin. Wet, moist, warm to the touch. I recoiled, while rising. The wood had grown a membrane, a layer between me and the past. And it wasn't alone. As I stepped back, the floor heaved. Beneath me, a long exhale. I fell. The floor gave way entirely, plunging me into a crawl space I hadn't known existed. It was narrow, tight, wet with condensation. The air was thick and smelled of old blood and something else, like dying flowers left too long in water. Around me were objects embedded in the walls. Lockets, children's shoes, teeth, fragments of mirrors, relics, offerings, memories stitched into bone and dirt. Something moved in the dark. I turned, scraping my knees against the wood, and saw the outline of a face pressing upward through the floor above me. It pushed, mouth open wide in silent scream. A woman's face, drawn, cracked, familiar. Agnes Bellgrave, the widow, no longer confined to mirrors. Her hands reached through the planks, fingertips long and sharp, clawing at the air. But she wasn't looking at me. She was looking beyond me. I turned again and saw them. The sleepers, dozens, not in cots or chambers, but cocooned in the very structure of the house. Their bodies partially fused into the walls, the beams, the ceiling supports. Mouths sewn shut, eyes open, breathing in unison. Watching, they were the breath beneath the floorboards. They had never left. I crawled backward, slipping on damp earth, lungs heaving as the air grew tighter. A whisper slid into my ears from every direction. The house must breathe. You must exhale. Give us your breath. I reached the hole above, pulled myself up, floorboards splintering under my weight. The room had changed. My possessions were gone. The bed was stripped. The walls were pulsing now, gently, lovingly, as if urging me to lie down and sleep. I ran to the mirror in the hall. My reflection smiled. I wasn't smiling, but it was. And behind my reflected form, the floorboards shifted again, rising as though something beneath were pushing upward, eager to break free. The testament now bore a new passage, freshly written in glistening ink. The breath returns to the vessel. The vessel returns to the floor. The floor becomes the family. The family becomes the house. The house no longer needed its heirs to walk. It only needed them to lie still and listen. The Bellgrave garden had once been beautiful. At least, that's what the journals claimed. Orchards, trellises, rare herbs that bloomed only in shadow. There had even been a hedge maze once, long raised, though its outlines still remained visible in the way grass refused to grow in a circular path near the southeastern slope. But by the time I had lived in the house long enough for it to open itself fully to me, the garden was something else entirely. It no longer breathed color. It breathed memory. And that memory was bone. No matter how many times I swept the soil, no matter where I stepped, fragments surfaced. At first I thought they were roots, twisted, pale, sharp. But roots don't splinter like that. Roots don't hold the curve of a rib or the delicacy of a child's finger joint. And roots do not ring faintly when struck by a spade. It began near the sundial. I had come to it again in the dim light of early morning, hoping to confirm what I had buried months before, that the boxes were still sealed. But the earth had shifted, sunken in places, bulging in others, like something beneath was moving, trying to rearrange itself. The soil was soft and oddly warm. Digging no longer required effort. The earth parted as though it had been instructed to. I did not find the box that day. Instead, I found what remained of a skull, small, fractured, with the molars missing. Packed inside, it was a red ribbon, the same type I'd seen in Sarah's drawings. And when I pulled it free, the surrounding soil collapsed slightly, revealing more vertebrae arranged in a gentle curve, like a sleeping child. There were no clothes, only the bone, only the ribbon. I covered it again. I whispered apologies. I don't know why. Later that day, I returned with gloves and proper tools. If the garden had chosen to reveal its secrets, I needed to face them fully. I mapped the area, marked each depression in the ground. By dusk, I had uncovered 8 full skeletons, each laid carefully, reverently, none twisted in panic or pain. Each accompanied by something, a lock of hair, a sewn-shut letter, a candle melted into the soil. But what chilled me most was the growth. There were plants in the garden, yes, but not flowers. No color. What grew here was wrong. Pale stalks with bone-colored stems, blossoms like curled fingernails, petals translucent and veined like skin. They had no scent, no resistance when plucked. And when I broke one open, it wept a milky fluid, thick and sweet, like spoiled sap. The testament referenced them only once, and a note tucked between sections of ritual. The garden must feed what memory leaves behind. Bone is the root of legacy. Growth is remembrance. I didn't know whether to be horrified or in awe. When I tried to burn the stalks, they screamed. Not loudly, not audibly, but inside my head. A pressure, a push, like being scolded by an angry parent for breaking something sacred. I dropped the torch and stepped back. The plants didn't burn. The flames died before reaching them. I wasn't meant to destroy them. I was meant to harvest. The next morning, I found a wooden bowl placed at the edge of the garden path. Inside were bone fragments, clean, arranged like petals. Beneath them, a note, written in the same red script that had guided me since the beginning. These are the seeds. Plant them where you remember best. I didn't question it. Not anymore. I took the bowl and returned to the far edge of the garden, where the trees parted slightly, revealing a patch of earth that I somehow recognized, though I had never seen it before. I knelt, dug, planted each shard as though it were a bulb, covered them gently, waited. Nothing happened at first, but the next day, something green had broken the soil. A single sprout, sharp, pale, throbbing faintly with life. And when I touched it, a memory filled my head, not mine, but someone else's. A woman laughing softly, a hand brushing hair from a child's face. A lullaby I had never heard, but somehow knew all the words to. I stumbled backward. The plant had shown me a memory, and I realized then what the garden had become. Not a burial ground, not a hiding place, but a library, a living archive. Each bone a root, each root a story, each story something waiting to be retrieved. The garden grew nothing but bone because bone is what the Bellgraves had left to plant. Their flesh had faded, their names had blurred, but bone remained. Bone remembered. In the weeks that followed, I planted more. I stopped digging to discover. I dug to preserve, to cultivate, to listen. Each time a memory returned, sometimes clear, sometimes broken, but always real. The garden began to pulse at night, glowing faintly beneath the moonlight. The plants no longer waited for my hands. They rose on their own, curling toward the sky like fingers reaching for recognition. Soon, others arrived, not from the town, from the walls, from beneath the floorboards. The sleepers. They wandered among the rows silently, touching the stalks, inhaling nothing. Sometimes they wept. Sometimes they smiled. None of them spoke. They didn't have to. This was their church, their tomb, their womb, a place to remember and be remembered. The plants would not wither. The soil would never freeze. And long after the house fell, and someday it might, the garden would remain. A bone-fed forest of memory, growing, spreading, waiting, still breathing in the dark. By the time I unearthed the final journal, I already knew what I would find. The house had shown me enough, through whispers in the walls, the groaning of floorboards, the rhythm of its breath pulsing just beneath my feet. But knowing and seeing are different things. When I turned the first page of the child-sized, leather-bound notebook hidden beneath a loose stone in the fireplace, my breath caught all the same. It wasn't the writing itself that chilled me. It was the age of it. The shaky penmanship, the misspellings, the loops of a child hand trying to sound older than they were. At the top of the first page, in red pencil, were 6 words. Today I went into the box. It was signed S.B. Sarah Bellgrave. What followed were simple, almost cheerful entries that made my stomach turn. It's not so bad. Mama says it's to make me brave. She gave me the bell. It's tied around my ankles so they can hear me if I need to come back up. But I'm not scared. I'm going to try to stay the full night this time. The full night. The next entry, dated 3 days later, was Messier. I try not to move, but it got really cold. I think I cried. I don't remember. But Mama says the crying is okay. Crying feeds the roots. She says the dark will listen to me better if I cry a little. Each page became more erratic after that. The lines bent. The grammar fractured. Ink smudged and mixed with something darker. The last 3 entries were nearly illegible, but I deciphered enough. Mama says I'm ready now. Ready for the full rest. She says the family did this forever. They all went into the box. Some of them never even came back. But that's okay. If you don't come back, it means you've been chosen to stay with the underneath. The final page read, "I can hear them now. They're not dead. They just got quiet. So quiet. They don't need mouths anymore. They talk through the wood. They say I'm doing good." The rest was smeared, fingerprints in dried blood. The Bellgraves didn't fear burial. They sought it. It was a rite, a sacrament, proof of faith. And those who remained sealed, who did not ring the bell tied around their ankle, were considered ascended, elevated, accepted by the house and its unseen roots. Those who rang the bell were permitted to leave to try again another time. But there was a limit. The testament made that clear in a margin note I hadn't understood before. The third return is shame. The fourth is exile. No one calls after the fifth. I return to the garden, to the sundial where I had once unearthed the child-sized box. I had filled it back in out of fear, out of guilt. But now I knew it hadn't been a burial site. It had been a classroom, proving ground. I began digging again, frenzied, dirt flying in all directions, my fingers raw and bleeding. And there, not far from where I had left the box, I uncovered them. Dozens of them. Coffin-sized containers arranged in neat rows beneath the surface. Some wood, some stone, others metal. Each was adorned with the Bellgrave sigil, burned or etched into its lid. Some were empty, others unknot. I forced myself to open only one. Inside was a man middle-aged, curled tightly in the fetal position, hands clasped to his chest. His mouth was sealed with wax, but his eyes were open, wide, alert, not fearful, but patient. And on his ankle a bell, untied, resting silently on his bare foot. I dropped the lid back in place and fell backward in the dirt. This wasn't a burial. It was selection. I crawled away and lay under the trees, trying to make sense of it. The Bellgraves hadn't tried to cheat death. They had redefined it. Life wasn't sacred to them. Silence was. Stillness. Surrender. The act of burial wasn't punishment. It was praise. And I had been invited. The testament had used the term vessel too many times for me to keep denying it. The house wasn't merely observing me anymore. It was preparing me, softening me, making me ready. And worse, I could feel something inside myself yielding. When I returned to the house, the floor no longer creaked under my steps. The walls no longer whispered at my passing. The temperature remained constant in every room, and the mirrors reflected me perfectly, too perfectly. My reflection no longer hesitated. It anticipated me. That night, I heard the sound again. The bell. Faint, muffled from beneath the floorboards. One chime, then silence, then another. I knew what it was. Sarah, not dead, not returned, just waiting. And now she was calling me. I lay in bed, too afraid to sleep, listening to the breathing of the house grow slower and deeper, as though it too were preparing for something, for the ritual to begin again. When I closed my eyes, I saw the box, felt the dirt press down around me, heard the soil shift, and in that moment, I understood why they did it. Because the silence below was not empty. It was full. It was peace. And it was calling me home. By the 16th day, I stopped saying the word dead out loud. Not because I feared the dead, at least not in the conventional sense, but because the house didn't accept the term. I learned that the hard way. It was after I returned from the garden, still shaken by the rows of buried bodies, still smelling of soil and sweat and something older, something chemical, like embalming fluid that had seeped into the ground over decades. I had stood over a grave and whispered, without thinking, "She's dead." Just those words, no more. Within moments, every light in the house extinguished itself. The wind, which had been still for hours, roared through the chimneys in a violent gust, even though the fireplaces were sealed. And then, from the corner of the room, the sound I now associated with disapproval for slow knocks. Not on wood, on stone, deep, hollow, final. When the lights returned, flickering, hesitant, I found a new message scrawled across the inside of my bedroom door, written in some substance darker and thicker than ink. "Do not speak lies in our home." From that point forward, I understood the Bellgraves never used the word dead, Not in speech, not in writing, not even in memorial. They had eradicated the concept from their language and replaced it with a lexicon of liminal states: dormant, resting, waiting, unvoiced, unreachable, unlit, beyond, below. I returned to the family archives and pored over letters, journals, and ceremony records. Over 2 centuries of documents, and never once did a Bellgrave write the word death. Even obituaries sent to the local paper were carefully phrased. Elias Bellgrave has entered repose. Thomas Bellgrave was accepted into the veil. Lenora Bellgrave has returned beneath. When an outsider used the word, neighbors, officials, even clergy, the letters recorded it as an offense, a breach, or a failure of comprehension. One passage in the Testament warned, to declare death is to sever memory. Severance invites silence. Silence invites forgetting. And forgetting is our only extinction. This was the core of it. The Bellgraves did not fear death as most people do. They feared erasure, annihilation through amnesia. For them, to be forgotten was to truly die, to have one's name fall out of memory and into dust. That is why they built the rituals, the family trees, the boxes beneath the garden. It wasn't about cheating death. It was about binding it, training it, forcing it into a state where memory ruled over biology. I started to see the system more clearly now. The family sustained themselves through recursive legacy. Each generation inherited not just names and heirlooms, but personalities, roles, even gestures. Children were taught to mimic the expressions of their ancestors. Diaries were written in mirrored handwriting. Some entries were copied word for word from earlier generations, like reenacting the soul's past in hopes of keeping it present. And when memory faltered, when a person no longer remembered their part in the lineage, they were given back to the house, never buried, just absorbed. I found a ledger in the study, handwritten and bound with dried ivy. It was titled simply, Declared, inside a list of names. Each line had 2 columns, proposed by and rejected by. The majority of the entries were crossed out, struck through in red with notes beside them. Proposed, Agnes Bellgrave, rejected, she still whispers in the mirrors. Proposed, Edwin Bellgrave, rejected, we saw his eyes open on the 3rd night. Proposed, Sarah Bellgrave, rejected, no submission authorized. Reserved by the house. One entry, however, stood out. It was mine. Proposed, my name pending. Monitored. Signs of transition observed. No rejection. Not yet. The list chilled me more than any grave, because it revealed that death among the Bellgraves wasn't something that happened, it was something that had to be approved, negotiated. And the only ones who had the power to approve it were those who had already crossed the threshold and decided to remain. I had not yet crossed, but they were watching me. That night, I heard my name whispered beneath the floorboards, not shouted, not demanded, but offered, like a prayer, or a preparation. I asked myself, what happens when someone is finally declared dead? Do they vanish from the house? From memory? I found the answer in the lowest corner of the library, behind a false panel. There, among mold-ridden manuscripts and crumbling sermons, was a small shrine, a stone pedestal. Upon it sat a single black candle, cold, burned halfway, and next to it a glass jar sealed with wax. Inside was dust, nothing more. No bone, no hair, just dust. The placard read, Nathaniel Bellgrave declared, and below that one final note, etched directly into the wood. We failed him. We forgot. I collapsed against the wall, shaking. For all their horror, their cruelty, their rituals, the Bellgraves believed they were preserving love. Twisted, yes, but sincere. In their view, to speak the word dead was to kill a second time, to sever the final strand that tethered the soul to memory. They needed memory to survive. They needed me to remember. But more than that, they needed me to not declare them dead. Because once I did, once I said the word, I would become the threat. And threats don't live long in the Bellgrave house. That night, I dreamed of standing in a room of mirrors, each one filled with the same scene. The parlor, the portraits, the breathing walls. In every reflection, I stood with my mouth sewn shut, a bell on my ankle, and a name tag pinned to my chest. Undeclared. When I woke, the bell was tied around my foot, and the floor beneath me was rising, ever so slightly, like breath drawn in for a final decision. It began with footsteps, measured, deliberate, unfamiliar. I had come to recognize the sounds each floorboard made, which groan was the stairs, which sigh belonged to the hallway corner that never quite sealed. But these were different. Lighter, but firm. Confident. Not the uncertain tread of the living, exploring the dark. These steps belonged to someone who had never forgotten the rhythm of the house. Someone who had once walked these halls with ownership, not curiosity. I followed them down the central corridor at dusk, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dried lilies. The glow from the sconces had dulled, flickering as though uncertain whether they should continue burning. And there, near the parlor, I saw her. Eliza Bellgrave. She stood at the threshold of the drawing room in full morning attire, high collar, black lace gloves, hair pinned into a perfect crown. Her skin had the sheen of wax, her mouth was pinched in the way of someone who had spent years being listened to. And though her eyes looked straight at me, they were distant, like mirrors that had forgotten how to reflect. She had returned, but it was no resurrection. She had never left. "Welcome home," she said, not aloud but into my mind, her voice a soft imprint like dust on vellum. I had read so many accounts of her, written by relatives, by maids, by town clerks who swore she had vanished during a winter storm in 1821, her body never recovered. And yet she stood before me, her posture regal, her shadow cast evenly across the room though no light touched her. "I watched you dig," she continued. "I watched you listen. You've done well." I stepped forward cautiously. "You've been here this whole time." She inclined her head slightly, not in confirmation but in acknowledgement of something more abstract, like an answer to a question I hadn't yet asked. "This house remembers. But so do we. Some memories need flesh. Others prefer stone. I chose breath. I didn't understand at first." But she continued, "I'm not spirit. I am memory made mobile. I am not bound by the testament, but I help write it. I've been walking the outer halls for decades, watching, waiting. You opened the vault. You fed the garden. You bled on the floorboards. The house responded. My knees grew weak. I had not summoned her. She had returned because the house itself had reached the proper saturation point. Enough memory. Enough silence. Enough cycles completed." Eliza stepped closer, her movements silent. She left no disturbance in the dust, no shift in air, yet I could feel her presence press against me, like standing too close to a deep, unmoving lake. "We were the first to understand that memory can replace mortality," she said. "The others, they buried, they mourned, they forgot. But forgetting is violence. We chose remembrance instead. And to remember properly, we stayed." I managed to whisper, "Is this what you wanted?" Her smile was thin. "Want is a child's word. We chose. Again and again. Ritual is choice repeated until it becomes law. This house is our sanctuary, yes, but also our scripture." She gestured toward the hearth, where the fire should have been dead for decades. Yet as she raised her hand, flame bloomed briefly, pale blue, casting her shadow against the wall like a massive, bird-like shape. "You will carry us," she said. I stepped back. "I don't want to become part of this." Her expression didn't change. "You already are. The moment you wrote the first entry, the moment you listened instead of escaping, you aligned your breath with ours. You felt it. The house matched your rhythm. That is not metaphor." I turned to leave, but she was already there, by the staircase, watching. She didn't block me. She didn't threaten. She simply said, "You don't have to stay in body. Few of us do. But stay in memory. Stay in word." That is how the line survives. Suddenly, I heard something I hadn't before. A chorus. Not voices in unison, but layers of breathing. From the walls. The garden. The floor. The mirror above the staircase reflected a dozen silhouettes standing in doorways behind me. Silent. Still. Breathing. And Eliza at the center. She lifted her right hand, and the testament appeared in the air, hovering like a heavy curtain caught mid-fall. It opened to a page not yet written. My name floated at the top. Below it, witnessed. Returned. Inhaled. She spoke again, not with sound, but presence. Write, and you will not fade. Leave the house, and we will remember you. But speak us aloud, declare us dead, and we will fall into ash. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. The curse was not that they couldn't die. The curse was that they could only be kept alive through us. Eliza stepped back into the shadows, her form growing less distinct. The parlor swallowed her, but not like a ghost. It felt like watching a painting fade, not with speed, but with deliberate care. And then she was gone. I stood alone at the edge of the firelight, and though she had vanished, the breathing remained. The house did not move. The walls did not creak. But the rhythm continued. Deep, even, patient. Somewhere upstairs, the floorboards groaned. In the garden, something rose softly through the soil. In the mirror, the glass shimmered faintly, and a silhouette watched me with familiar eyes. The house was preparing again. The next memory was being chosen. And I was already inside it. By the time Eliza Bellgrave returned, the house no longer tried to pretend it was built for the living. The air hung heavier than before, not simply stale but ripe, as if the estate had begun to ferment from within. Light came not from lamps, but from places where the walls themselves glowed dimly, the same way fungi emit their own radiance when kept in dark, damp places long enough. My skin itched constantly. My breath felt slower. The days began to dissolve, separated not by sleep but by the growing silence that hummed through every plank and panel. And yet, amid this decline, Eliza came back, not as a ghost, not in dreams, but in full form. She appeared one morning in the dining room, seated at the head of the table as though she had never left, dressed in a high-collared black gown trimmed with lace that moved without air. Her hands were folded, her eyes open but distant. Her lips were still, but I heard her voice clearly. Inside my head, "You've opened the house properly," she said. Not all heirs know how to listen. I froze, unsure whether to speak or to run. No need for fear, her voice continued, calm, fluid. "You've already been accepted. The others simply wait until the final breath leaves your denial." She moved her hand across the table and gestured to the testament, which had appeared beside a long-dead plate of food. "Do you know what that book is really for?" I nodded, though uncertainly. "It's not a record. It's not a spell book. It's not a gospel. It's a contract. And every page is a consent form." She stood then, the floor not creaking beneath her, only adjusting, like the house flexed to cradle her feet. Her form was lithe, her features preserved not by time, but by intention. She was not young, but neither was she old. She had the look of someone who'd chosen not to decay. "We were never cursed," she said, turning to face the cracked portrait of Sarah. "We agreed. All of us. In our own ways, we signed. You think horror is thrust upon us? That this house was inflicted? No, we built it. We are it." I found my voice. "Why?" Her head tilted slightly, like a teacher amused by a naive question. "Because memory is the only immortality worth having." She walked slowly toward the parlor, and I followed, drawn despite myself. The walls around us vibrated gently, as if they recognized her presence and hummed in acknowledgement. The portraits we passed had changed again, not only in gaze, but in content. New faces. My face. Slightly off, slightly older. A version of myself I'd never met. "Death isn't the end," Eliza said. "Death is a deeder. A door you don't have to walk through, unless you want to. Most do. But not us." We stopped before a mirror, the largest one in the house, the one no one had dared to cover. Eliza turned to face me, and this time she spoke aloud. Her voice was quiet. "Oh, we chose to stay. Not because we feared what came after, but because we believed the world would forget us if we left. We believed memory was fragile, that it needed to be held." Her reflection in the mirror began to move out of sync with her body. "And the longer we stayed, the stronger we became. Because nothing strengthens memory more than repetition, then echo, then ritual." She turned to me, her voice softer now. "That's why the floor breathes. That's why the walls whisper. That's why the house rearranges itself around you. You're being remembered by something older than you, deeper than blood." I shook my head, trying to resist. "It's unnatural." She smiled faintly. "Nature forgets you in time. We do not. That's why it's not a curse. It was never a curse. It was a choice." I asked, "But Sarah? The burials? The silence? The stitching of mouths?" That wasn't choice, that was cruelty. Eliza paused. Cruelty is a language. It speaks when gentler words fail. Sarah was prepared. We all were. That was the price. She moved again, now toward the fireplace. A breath of wind passed through the hearth, though no window was open. She reached into the ashes and pulled out a piece of bone. This was Agnes, my mother. She tried to leave. She tried to let the world outside in. It took her voice, but she never really left. We remember her now, in small parts. This one is mine. She crushed the bone in her hand. It dissolved into ash that hung in the air like perfume. You have until the breath stops, she said, turning her head slowly toward me. Then the house will ask. Not force. Just ask. With that, she vanished. Not with drama, not with flourish. Just a slow fading, like mist retreating into the morning sun. And I was alone again. Except I wasn't. Because from the corners of every room, from behind the portraits, the vents, the stairwells, I felt them. The others. The remembered. The waiting. Not hostile. Just present. Expectant. I returned to my room. The bell was gone from my ankle. In its place, a sigil had formed on my skin, written wrong. The same shape etched on every sealed coffin in the vault. A mark of belonging. A mark of welcome. The testament sat on my bed, open to a new page. It was blank, waiting for my hand, for my consent. No force, no coercion, only the weight of 1,000 choices made before me. The house did not demand servitude. It simply asked to be remembered. And it would remember me, forever. I write this now with fingers that no longer feel like my own. The bones beneath them are mine, yes, and the ink that stains my skin is familiar. But there is something deeper, some lacing of thought and memory that no longer belongs solely to me. I am becoming plural. I am no longer I in the sense I once understood it. There are echoes now, a second rhythm beneath my breath. My heart no longer beats alone. This will be my final entry. Not because I am in danger, not because I am afraid, but because I finally understand what the house has been trying to say. And because soon, very soon, I will no longer need to write. I will be remembered. The transformation began quietly. The first sign was the mirror, where I saw myself mouthing words I had not spoken. Then came the handwriting. I looked back at notes I had taken weeks ago and saw that my script had changed. Sharper now, neater, identical to the entries written by Thomas Bellgrave, whose journals I had spent days reading, a mat, down to the curvature of the T's and the slope of the Y's. Then the voices, not hallucinations, not the whispers in the walls I once feared. These were voices in my thoughts, not intrusive, not commanding, just the present, reminding, guiding. When I forgot the name of a room or the placement of an old book, one of the voices would quietly supply the answer. Sometimes in Eliza's tone, sometimes in Sarah's, and then once in my own, but from years ago. Words I had written in childhood. A memory no one could have had but me. Yet the house knew. The house spoke it back to me. The boundaries were dissolving. Last night, I found the ledger again. The one label declared. My name was gone. In its place, etched into the bottom of the page, were 5 words. He never had to be. A rejection of the concept. Not just of death, but of finality. That same night, the house opened a room I had never seen. It smelled of parchment and wax and something faintly sweet, like dried fruit and preserve herbs. Inside was a desk, a chair, a window that looked out over the garden. On the desk, a single object, a quill. Beside it, a sheet of parchment. On it was written, "Write the history." From inside, and beneath that, then close the book. I sat for hours, unable to touch the pen, not from fear, but from awe. I understood finally what they had been preserving all along. Not just bodies, not just names, but perspective, consciousness, thought. The Bellgrave line had no intention of fading. They had chosen instead to collect themselves, each branch, folded back into the estate's memory like layers of sediment, preserved in walls, floorboards, breath, and blood. A living archive. and the only way to join them fully was to stop recording and become the record itself. This journal, my journal, has no place in the house. It is an artifact of resistance, of hesitation, and I am past that now. This morning, I woke to find my name etched not in the testament, but in the very wood of my doorframe. A living knot of blackened script, pulsing faintly, warm to the touch. A signature. The house had accepted me. I stepped barefoot onto the hallway floor and felt it breathe beneath me, not as a warning, not as hunger, but as welcome. Like a home sighing when its last room has finally been filled. As I moved through the house, every portrait I passed showed a different version of myself, young, old, cloaked in dust or wrapped in ritual. But all of them were smiling. All of them content. Even Sarah. In her portrait, the book was closed now. Her bell lay silent in her lap, and she looked at peace. I made my way to the garden one last time. The sun barely reached the soil there anymore. The trees had overgrown, curling in protective shapes, forming arches above the burial sites like ribs around a sleeping heart. The boxes were sealed. The roots had curled around them. Nothing stirred beneath. And yet I knew they were still breathing. Not in a way visible to the world, but through the house, through me, through the story. I returned to my desk, to this journal, to this final page, not to resist, but to remember, because someone must always remember. That is the price. That is the oath. That is the choice. I am no longer a guest, no longer an observer, no longer the historian. I am the history. The bell will not ring. The soil will not be disturbed. I will not be declared, but I will remain, and the house will breathe me in, and someone someday will come here, will find what I've found, will hear the creaking of the stairs, the hum of the walls, the soft knock in the night, and they will begin to write, just as I did, and the cycle will hold, because the Bellgraves do not die. They sleep, they whisper, they wait, and no, so do I. It has been some time since the last word was written, though no one here measures time in days or seasons anymore. Time in the Bellgrave house is marked by breath, when it slows, when it quickens, when it pauses entirely as if listening. And when it does, so do we. The house is dark now, not from decay or abandonment, but by choice. Light has no place in a structure that thrives on memory. Sunlight is fickle, cruel in its honesty. But darkness remembers everything. And in the dark, we are still breathing. Some say houses die when no one lives in them, that they collapse inward, consumed by rot and disrepair. But the Bellgrave house never empties. It absorbs. It grows dense with occupancy, thick with presence. A stranger stepping inside might call it quiet, might think it abandoned. But that's only because we've learned not to move when we're being watched. We know how to remain still. We know how to wait. Even now, someone walks the halls. He moves slowly, cautiously, unsure if he is alone. He sees the cracked portraits. He smells the sweet rot beneath the boards. He notices how the mirrors refuse to reflect correctly. He questions. He records. He lingers longer than he should. And the house begins to watch him. We do not rush these things. Induction takes time. Resistance is natural. He will spend the first few nights thinking of escape. He will feel watched, unnerved. He will dream of voices he's never heard before. He will wake to find his handwriting changed, the floor pulsing faintly beneath him, the rooms shuffling when he isn't looking. It's all part of the remembering. It's how the house lets him know he's being memorized. Downstairs, beneath the library, the vault doors remain closed. Not sealed, merely resting. The chains are slack now. Not because they've broken, but because they're no longer needed. Those they once held have moved elsewhere. Some into the walls. Some into the garden. Some into the breath itself. There is no distinction now between the architecture and the ancestry. The wooden beams know our names. The stones hum when the bloodline is spoken. Even the soil, black and spongy, yields more easily when touched by one of us. The earth beneath this hill no longer belongs to the world above. It has been written and repeatedly pressed upon by centuries of memory until it became scripture. I know this because I am part of it. I no longer sleep, not in the human sense, I rest in corners. I press myself into shadows. I become the outline of someone not yet visible in the mirror. Sometimes I am a creak in the stairwell. Sometimes I am the wind under the eaves. And sometimes I return to the journal. My hand remembers how to write, though the skin is no longer what it was. My thoughts are not entirely my own. They are echoes, collated impressions from others who came before. Thomas, Agnes, Eliza, Sarah. Their fears, joys, rituals, all present, all accessible. When I recall something, I cannot always be sure it was ever truly mine. But it doesn't matter. The house does not care about authorship. It only cares that we are remembered. Outside, the town pretends. Gray Marrow still stands, but it is hollow now. They whisper about the house. They avoid the road. They make up stories to explain the sounds in the night. But the older ones know. They never speak the name aloud. They never point. Because they understand that speaking names gives them shape. And once shaped, they return. There is a child now, one of ours, a descendant who has never been to the estate. He draws strange buildings in school. He dreams of gardens with boxes and knows their contents. His parents are worried. They say he sometimes speaks with an accent no one taught him, that he hums songs no one recognizes, that he draws his own family tree with names long forgotten. He is remembering. The house will call to him one day. It always does. And when he arrives, it will open for him as it did for me, for Eliza, for Sarah. It will breathe him in gently, show him the places no one else can see. It will leave messages on his pillow. It will hum beneath his bed, and he will think it's his imagination at first. But the voice in the walls will say his name in the same way it said mine. It won't be long now. The cycle holds. The breath continues. I have forgotten what my body once felt like. I don't miss it. There is comfort in being atmospheric and becoming the dust that never settles. I move through the cracks, watching, listening, waiting. Sometimes I rest beneath the floorboards. Other times, I press my ear against the walls to hear who walks above. They all walk above eventually. Some ring the bell. Most don't. And those who don't are remembered, revered, rewritten. This is not a haunting. This is not a curse. This is a chorus. We do not scream. We do not shout. We exhale. And if you stand still long enough, if you listen when the wind dies and the house creaks, you will hear us, breathing, still, in the dark, waiting for you.